In this video, we will discuss Apocryphal literature and the New Testament. In previous videos, we have discussed the New Testament canon. Now, the New Testament canon that we have today in most Bibles consists of 27 books. But remember that the New Testament canon was not set until around the 4th century CE. So we have 2 to 3 centuries before this time when texts were being written and were still considered important for Christianity. There were not just 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but many. There were not just the Pauline epistles that we have within the New Testament, but other epistles, some that were believed to have been Pauline and some that were not. The canon is, by the 4th century and afterwards, the most important religious Christian text for the tradition. However, before this, we see a lot of other texts that deal with the same issues of Christianity, some in very similar ways, and some in a bit different ways. We call these texts the Apocrypha. Apocrypha is Greek that literally means hidden. Now, if you have a New Oxford Annotated Bible, or a Catholic or some kind of other Bible besides a Protestant one, you'll probably notice that there are Apocrypha in the middle of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Now, the Apocrypha that you find here are the Old Testament Apocrypha. These are books like Judith and First Maccabees and so on. And while these are important, we want to look beyond these to the New Testament Apocrypha. In the New Testament, you might have noticed that there are issues with authorship and competing ideas. The New Testament Apocrypha are even more contested than the text that we have here as far as authorship and ideas that we see. However, a lot of the stories that we find in popular imagination or stories today come from these apocryphal texts, not from the New Testament itself. For example, the idea that Peter was martyred upside down on a cross comes from the act of Peter rather than from the New Testament itself. So let's take a look at some of this apocryphal literature that we find. While some of the New Testament Apocrypha that we have were texts that were passed down over the centuries, some were rediscovered in 1945 with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt. The Nag Hammadi Library contained many different texts. Very many of them were Christian, and they often had Gnostic influences. For this reason, many of the texts were dismissed as not worthy of being included in the New Testament canon. Among these were the Gospel of Thomas, which, as you'll note, when we discussed the Synoptic Gospels, some scholars, though not a majority, believe that the Gospel of Thomas, or at least some parts of it, were the Q or Quail source that was used for Matthew and Luke's Gospels. The Acts of Peter and the 12 was also found among the Nag Hammadi Library. And a lot of what we see in these New Testament apocryphal texts are ideas that were quite different from mainstream Christianity. And very many of these ideas had Gnostic influences, which we find among the Nag Hammadi Library texts. Now, as you've read through the New Testament, you've probably noticed that we have different genres throughout. We begin with Gospels, we have the Acts of the Apostles, epistles, you even have a sermon, and we also have apocalyptic literature in the form of the Book of Revelation. We find these genres among the New Testament Apocrypha as well. So the 4 Gospels we see, the epistles we see, the Book of Revelation, are not the only types of Christian texts in these genres. One of the most popular Gospels in the New Testament Apocrypha is the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is set up as a collection of sayings of Jesus. And while the idea of a gospel being the good news makes sense here, we don't see the same gospel structure that we do in Matthew and Mark and the canonical Gospels, with the setup of a narrative of the life of Jesus. We also find the infancy Gospel of Thomas in New Testament Apocrypha. If you ever wonder what happened during Jesus' childhood, the infancy Gospel of Thomas, as well as some other infancy Gospels, answer this. The infancy Gospel of Thomas has some very odd depictions of Jesus. He creates clay birds that he gives life to. He kills his childhood friends for upsetting him. And most early church fathers viewed this text as heretical. We also find the Gospel of Peter, which switches the blame of the crucifixion of Jesus from Pontius Pilate to Herod Antipas. Most scholars believe that this postdates the synoptic Gospels that we find in the New Testament by at least a century. But John Dominic Crossan, who is among the minority here, believes that it predates the synoptic Gospels and is one of the original stories of the crucifixion narrative. We also find the secret Gospel of Mark here. This is set up to basically add more to the Gospel of Mark, and Clement I possibly cites this in one of his letters, though the letter of Clement where he cites it is not necessarily an authentic letter, just debated among scholars. We also find the Gospel of Mary. Most people think this is Mary Magdalene, though there's debate whether it's Mary Magdalene, or Mary the mother of Jesus, or even a sister of Jesus named Mary. There are many, many more Gospels in the New Testament Apocrypha. Some dated earlier than these, some dated much later. There are also ones that we don't have full texts of, but we know exist because they're quoted and cited by other church fathers. Just like we have the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament canon, we also find Acts of Apostles and other important New Testament figures among the New Testament Apocrypha. One of these is the Acts of Philip, which sets up a Christian community that was defined by its vegetarianism, celibacy, and equality between men and women. Women dressed the same as men and had leadership roles just the same as men, which in some ways was pretty new for the time period and from some of the other Christian communities. We also find the Acts of Andrew, which teaches about morals and has miraculous supernatural stories throughout it. Although the church father Eusebius thought it was heretical, he himself was deemed heretical later. We find the Acts of Barnabas. If you remember in Acts of the Apostles, we find Barnabas who works alongside Paul and helps him enter the Christian community after persecuting Christians. The Acts of Barnabas claims to have been written by John Mark, who we also see in Acts of the Apostles, but is clearly a 5th century text based on the writing style and language used. We also find the Acts of Peter. As I mentioned earlier, this is where we find the story of Peter's martyrdom. He claims that he is not worthy of being crucified in the same manner as Jesus, so he begs to be crucified upside down. Again, just like the Gospels, there are many more Acts of Apostles and other important figure stories out there, but these are some of the highlights. While the non-canonical Gospels and Acts stories make up a significant portion of the New Testament Apocrypha, we also find many other texts, including apocalypses and epistles. Now, if you remember, the book of Revelation is an apocalypse, a story that focuses on future judgment, cosmic destruction, and tells a story in some kind of coded fashion. The Apocalypse of Peter is very similar and has a setup with Peter finding out through a vision about what heaven and hell are like and different moral issues. The way that we see Dante's Inferno about 1,000 years later, working with sins people committed during life and being punished for those sins in similar fashions. We see the Apocalypse of Peter doing the same thing for people who were heretics or hanged by their tongue, and so on. Clement I considered the Apocalypse of Peter a canonical text and holy and inspired. The Apocalypse of Paul is more than likely a reworking of the Apocalypse of Peter, with different additions and reworking of the text. It did not have the same importance as the Apocalypse of Peter to some early church fathers, but we see these same kind of apocalyptic ideas in this text as well. We also find the Didache among the New Testament Apocrypha. The Didache is quite different from a lot of other New Testament canonical and non-canonical texts. It was written probably in the 1st century, predating several of the New Testament canonical texts that we have, and is often called the Teachings of the 12 Apostles. It focuses quite a bit on church organization and structure, and discusses baptism and Eucharist, and a lot of the language used in here is very similar to what we find in the Gospel of Matthew. While the New Testament canon is of course important for helping us understand the beginnings of this early Christian movement, all the way through how it is interpreted in the 21st century, we cannot dismiss the apocryphal texts simply because they were not included in this canon. The apocryphal text can be especially helpful in helping us understand about this early Christian movement as well as some offshoots of it, such as the community that we find in the Acts of Philip, who was vegetarian and celibate and had gender equality. So when we talk about the Apocrypha, we want to focus on the significance of what was included and what was not included in the canon, and to ask ourselves the question of why these things were and were not included. We have influential church figures such as Clement I, who I've mentioned several times throughout this video. Clement was a bishop of Rome and was supposedly chosen and ordained by Peter as bishop, and he became the 4th pope of the church. He wrote a text called the Epistle of Clement, and has some other texts that are claimed to be written by him, though most scholars do not think he did. What we do know is that Clement I, along with many other early church fathers, were influential in choosing what books were in the canon. Now remember that this was a selection process over time. These early church fathers were not sitting down and saying, let's figure out what to put together in this book we're going to call the New Testament. Rather, they would study texts and understand what they believed to be authoritative and oriented towards God, and helping them understand God and this new religious tradition. While some people, such as Clement I, had a few texts that they thought should be canonical that were dismissed, such as the Apocalypse of Peter, most of the people in power had the same ideas of what would be canonical texts. The New Testament canon that we have is composed of books that were mostly not contested and were never deemed heretical, except for the Book of Revelation. The New Testament canon is essentially a collection of the texts that had a similar idea and did not have anything that would be considered offensive in this early Roman religion and in terms of Jewish culture. Bart Ehrman writes, "The victors in the struggles to establish Christian orthodoxy not only won their theological battles, they also rewrote the history of the conflict. Later readers then naturally assumed that the victorious views had been embraced by the vast majority of Christians from the very beginning." Ehrman puts it well here to explain that this was simply a triumph of certain Christian thinkers who established what text would be understood as correct and authoritative, and what text would be considered heretical. Now, as we study these texts academically and from a historian's perspective, we can find merit in both types, because these help us understand the different ways the early Christians thought and worshipped God. Now that we have reached the end of this video, you should be able to define Apocrypha and explain why certain New Testament apocryphal texts were not included in the canon, describe the apocryphal texts mentioned in this video, and explain the significance of the Apocrypha to an understanding of early Christianity.